Okay, so welcome to session one for Scorch, the web development course. So thanks for being here. Just a couple things I'll go over again, just because we went over them last time, but went over them pretty quickly. So streak score for the Ignite points. So if you have your consistent attendance, you'll basically gain an extra 5 points on top of your previous amounts that you gained before, and you'll gain that each day that you go. So essentially, if you make it for example, here, we get 5 points for the first session, 10 for the second, 15 for the third, etc. But then if you miss one, then you go back down to 0 and then start from 5 each session from there. So good idea to show up for all the sessions, basically. And the second thing is the Discord. So if you haven't already, the Discord link is there. The slides are set up and they are on the website now. So if you go to shieldandnight.com and you go under the sessions tab and click on Scorch, you'll find the links to the slides, which has the link to the Discord. I can also get somebody wouldn't mind shooting that in the chat as well. That'd be great. And then check your email for your week and your group number, and then just say set essentially on the Discord chat to be able to get yourself added into whatever channel you're supposed to be part of for your mentor. So that'd be good. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? So we're going to cover the anatomy of a web page, the basics of HTML and CSS, which are two of the languages that make up most of the web. And we're going to look at how to sort of go through and look at other people's web pages, take them apart, and judge them for it. So it'll be a lot of fun. So you can find the slides, like I said, at shieldandnight.com, and you can get the exercise files at the link that's down there. And if you haven't downloaded them yet, go ahead and download them to make sure you have them ready for today. So starting off, what does a web page actually do when you actually first load the page? So when you type in Google, a couple questions: how does your browser actually know what to show you? How does it know what the content should look like? How does it know what Google is supposed to look like? And then how, when you actually search, what actually happens? And then how does your browser actually get the information? So how do you actually go out and you have a computer on your desk? How does it actually talk to the world, essentially? These are some of the questions that we're going to try and cover throughout the course, and we're going to try and cover a couple of those today as well. So first off is, what is a web page? So web pages, generally speaking, are comprised of three different elements, or three different languages, I should say. HTML, which defines sort of the structure and the content of the page, sort of where the text is, where the images are, all that sort of stuff. CSS defines how it looks, sort of how things look, different colors, all that sort of stuff. And then the JavaScript defines sort of the behaviors. So whenever you do something as a nice fancy animation and stuff like that, all that would be JavaScript. So start off with the basics of HTML. So like I said, this is basically the structure of the page. It's composed of any nouns you find on a page will typically be the HTML. So that block of text or that image underneath. So the fact that it's the actual, if we look at this blue block of text and the image underneath it, the fact that the block of text is a block of text and the fact that the image sits underneath it is the HTML. Essentially, this is set up in a way where you have elements. So at the top here, there is a text element called an H1 element or a heading element. And then below that, we have an image element. And so each element in HTML basically has three parts to it. So you have the tags, which has a start and an end tag, and inner content and attributes. And the last two are basically optional. So as we're going to go through and talk about all of this, you can go through and start building a page as we're talking about it. We're going to be covering the basics as we go. So basically, if you want to go ahead and if you find a folder, if you have the main folder that you're using for the Ignite sort of exercises, and just pop that open. If you want to pop open a Visual Studio Code window in there, and you can just start by setting up just a page in here, just something.html just call it something.html in this case. Once you create that, then we can start just basically adding stuff in as we go. And you can do it on whatever you want. We have some suggestions. So you can do it based on either yourself, or you can do it based on a fictional character or a movie or anything that you like, really. So here's some examples. So the one on the left is about me, and the one on the right is about a game called Oxygen Not Included. So you can do it about whatever you want and just sort of build and use these elements as we're going. So the syntax for creating elements. So the first thing is the tags. So like I was saying before, you have a start tag and an end tag. So you can see here, you basically have these little angle brackets, and then you have the one at the end here has the angle brackets, and then you have a slash that says the end. So this is the start, this is the end, and it matches based on whatever the thing is that you put in the middle here. So that's called the tag name. And that basically defines sort of what shows up and how it shows up. And the stuff inside here is what I was saying before, which is the inner content. So basically, when you have a tag, you can actually go into Visual Studio Code, and if you want to do something faster, if you type in any tag name and just hit enter, it'll actually create one for you. So if I type H1 and hit enter, it'll add the rest of the stuff for me. So you can see here, I now have a tag where it's encapsulated with these angle brackets, and then we have the stuff there. And I can start typing stuff into here. And if I go ahead and actually just drag this into my browser, we can see exactly what that looks like right there. So essentially, all of your HTML is going to be built up with these tags. So start tag, end tag, stuff in between. Not every tag will have stuff in between, by the way. You can, it's optional. And sometimes even the end tag can be optional, like for images, for example. There's no end tag in an image, it'll automatically end itself. So we already saw the H1 tag that I just showed you before, but then another common tag that you have is paragraph. So this is basically just for like typically longer content. So you do a paragraph, you put your text inside of it, and basically you just get the same sort of text, but smaller. So if we come back to here and I go ahead, add in a paragraph tag and type some more stuff and save it, then when I refresh the page here, we'll see the smaller text show up below. So the HTML itself is just a good way of just sort of like making the content that you want, and some of the choices that you make as far as what tags you choose will change how it shows up. So we already saw H1. There's also H1 to H6. So H2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As you go up, the text gets smaller. So H1 is the largest, H6 is the smallest. And basically just the exact same thing that we've seen before. So H1 will be big text, and then H6 will be smaller text, but slightly larger than a paragraph. You can use them however you want. Typically, people will use them in order. So they'll have like one H1 on a page to be like the main title for the page, and then they'll have like an H2 for different sections and all that sort of stuff, but you can set them up however you want, really. So sometimes with some of the elements that we're using, we're going to want to have some sort of data. And so with that data, let's say, for example, we want to have a link. So we want to have a link for somebody to click and go from there. Like you've seen probably on a ton of pages. How do we do that? So this is what's called an A or an anchor tag. And then we add in what are called attributes. So same way that you've seen in Python previously with classes, this is basically the exact same idea. Attributes are basically just some data that you can associate to whatever the element is that you're looking at. So if we consider like an anchor tag, we can see here that it asks me to put in an href. This href is going to be basically the link that it's going to go to. So I go ahead and I say https google.ca, and then I put some text in here like hello world. If I go ahead and save that now, come back to here and refresh, we can see here we have a little link. If we click it, it'll take us there. So the href is basically an attribute that's giving it some information about where to go. And so there'll be different attributes for different elements. There are some that are global across all elements, but most attributes will be specific to whatever element you're using. Like images, for example, you have to define like where it should go to look for the image. Videos are a bit the same. For links, you have to say where you want to go, that sort of stuff. You can also do this for configuration values. So another option is that there's a thing called target in anchor tags. And if we make the target underscore blank like this will basically change the anchor tag from being an anchor tag that opens the link in the same window. So you can see here when I click, opens it in the same window. But if I refresh now, after I've added that blank and click, it'll open a new tab for me. So basically you can make your HTML elements configurable to whatever you want with the attributes that you put on there. So like I was saying before, you can basically add underscore blank to make it so that it can go to a different page. Now, you can actually nest HTML elements inside of each other. So one way that this is super handy is if you want to have sort of bigger text and you want to be able to put a link inside of it, you can basically wrap that all in an anchor tag. So if I have, for example, this text in here, and let's say this FA is really important to me, the FA part, I want to have this be a link. This is a really good spot for a link. So I go ahead, I create a link, put the FA inside there, and then give it some sort of a URL. So google.ca again, and then I go ahead and refresh the page. You can see here now we can have an element basically inside of another element. So we can use this for a whole bunch of different things. We can sort of stack elements inside of each other. So we can have some text that's bigger, some text that's smaller. We can change the sizing, all that sort of stuff. But basically the important thing is that you can stack stuff inside of other stuff. And so there's two different types of inner content. So the inner text and the inner HTML. So if I ever say the inner HTML, what that means is that it's essentially everything between these, between the tags. So you can see here with the H1 tag, I'll actually make this a little bit bigger. With the H1 tag, the inner HTML would be all of this, including the tag inside of it. Whereas the inner text would just be SDA space FA. Basically, it would strip all the tags out of here. So that's just important for later on when we talk about JavaScript. When you're talking about an inner HTML versus inner content versus inner text, the inner text will strip away every element. The inner HTML will be including all the elements that are inside it, essentially. Okay, first quick question. So this will be popping up in the Zoom chat is what are the elements here and what are their attributes? Okay, so we actually have a split decision here between A and D. Didn't even occur to me that sometimes it's actually referred to in two different ways. So this is actually my bad. Technically, both answers would be right, depending on who you're talking to. So the attributes themselves, the actual attributes are typically referring to what the actual thing is that you're assigning. So in that case, it would be A. But some people do refer to the attributes as the actual values of the attributes themselves. So I think actually in this case, probably either one would be reasonable to say is correct. Apologies about that. I didn't even think about that. So yeah, but basically in this case, we have a div, which is an element that we have, that we then have an h1 and an anchor tag, which are all the elements. And then the attributes themselves would be attribute one, href, target. Or if you're going by the values would be value, and then Google, and then blank. So now a second question is, what would show up with this HTML? Okay, so this one is another split decision as well. So in this case, the A answer would be correct for the actual values that are there. So everything that's there that would show up would be correct for how it is. And then the actual answer to what would happen is E. So in this case, nothing would show up. So we'll take for the first question, we'll take the two answers that I talked about. And for this question, we'll also take the two answers that I talked about as well. So for this one, the reason why nothing will show up is because this hidden part at the top here. And the reason why I brought this question up is because anything that you do for anything that's inside, a lot of the stuff will actually carry down. So essentially the consequences of what happens up here will carry down to the things that are inside of it. So this is called the parent, and then the child essentially would be the children that are inside of it. So because hidden is true, this is basically one of those things that I was saying is a global attribute that's available. So this is basically, it will hide whatever the thing is. It will also hide everything inside of it. So you have to be careful when you're making HTML, because the things that you do to whatever's at the top will also come down. So if you change the color of like what the text should be inside here, it will also change the color of what the text will be in here as well. So you need to be careful. These elements aren't separated. They follow a hierarchy, and it falls down as you go. So A or E would be fine for that one, essentially. But the actual answer is that nothing would show up. So some of the text to talk about, images. So images are probably one of the only tags I can think of off the top of my head that doesn't have a closing tag. So images, you just put the regular image and you put in an attribute for wherever you want to send, wherever you want to get the link from. So if I go ahead and I actually grab this URL here, pop it open in the browser, you can see here, I have an image that shows up there. So if I go ahead and I create an image tag, image, and I have this SRC right here. We don't need to worry about the other two. The SRC right there, basically pop it in there, go ahead and go. We can see the image. Now, as you can see, it doesn't bother trying to do anything with any resizing. If this image is like a 12K image and it makes it go all the way across the screen, it will just let that happen. It doesn't care. The browser doesn't care about doing that. The browser doesn't care about making it look nice. To be honest with you, most developers don't care about making their pages look nice either. So it doesn't try and do anything for you. So you have to just make sure that you actually do whatever you want to do. So if you want it to be a certain height or anything like that, you have to specify that also as an attribute in here. So if you want to say like height is going to be like 200, and then we're going to say like the width is going to be, let's say like 4, or let's say 100. So it's 2 by 1 in this case. Now when we refresh, now it looks better. Essentially. But all that it'll try and do is it'll basically just use whatever the default sizing of the image is. And since this is an SVG, it is a massive image. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so some more complicated ones. Lists. So there's basically two different types of lists, and they're set up in the exact same way, which is very handy because you can switch between them super easily. But essentially, you have two components to a list. You have whatever defines how the list should be split up, and then the actual items themselves. So when we're taking a look at a list here, this is what's called an ordered list. So this will go 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., based on how many of these list items are inside. So the ordered list here, and then how many list items are inside will basically show up with, it'll just count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If you want to have just bullet points, you just switch the O to a U, and then it's an unordered list. So ordered list, unordered list, essentially. But both of these are the exact same, where you just add the list items into them, and then whatever the thing is that's on the outside, so whatever the list type is, will change how it shows up. So this will show up with some bullet points, this one will show up with some numbers. And the next one that's used super often to have a bunch of elements inside of it is a div. So we already saw it before, but divs are often used to basically group a whole bunch of elements together. This will be super handy later on when we talk about CSS, because that whole stacking hierarchy that I was talking about, where things inside have the same sort of effect as whatever is on the outside of them, is exactly the same here. So if you change any of the stuff in here, like what the text color should be, anything like that, you just have to change the text color on this div element, and it'll carry down to these items below it as well, which can be super handy instead of having to like go through and say, oh, I want the H2, I want the paragraph, I want all these different items that are inside here. You just say, okay, I want to change the div, and then the actual consequences carry down from there. So super handy to use and put everything inside divs. And then lastly, we have comments. So comments, basically you just start as if you're going to do a tag, except for you just do the, basically an exclamation point. So exclamation point, and then 2 dashes, and then it ends with these 2 dashes like that. And you can put whatever you want in here. None of it will show up. So if I go ahead and I'll actually just grab this and I'll say do a div right here, and then I'll put these 2 inside of a div. And what you'll see here is that nothing will look different visually. If I go ahead and refresh, nothing looks different visually, other than the fact that it's on this side now, because I moved it across. But essentially now these 2 are inside a div. So any of the changes that I make to this div would carry down to each of these 2 items as well. Okay, so there's some advanced tags that you can take a look at, like forms, tables, all that sort of stuff. You can look at the documentation whenever you want. But the last thing that I want to talk about for just regular old HTML is how you actually create an HTML document. So we have linked a template in here. There is a much faster way of doing this. Essentially, there is 4 parts. There's what's called the type declaration, which appears at the top, the actual HTML tag, the head tag, and the body tag. And the way you can do this in VS Code that makes it super easy to do, instead of having to worry about any of this ever, is just put an exclamation point at the top of your file, hit enter, and it will create all of the stuff for you. So this is the type declaration at the top. The browser can obviously load different files. It doesn't have to load an HTML file. It can load a PDF, whatever it wants. So this is one way of indicating what type of document you're using. You then have an HTML tag, which is basically where you're saying all the stuff in here is HTML. You then have a head tag, which includes data about your page. So it includes like the title that should show up in the top here. So like in here where it says something.html, that's because my file name is called something.html, but I could name this like my page, for example, and then refresh it. And you can see here now it says my page at the top. So essentially this is all the metadata about the page up here. And then inside here, inside this body is where you want to put the content. So the fact that I have the content down here is actually going to cause some things to break in some browsers. So what I can do is I just take this stuff, chuck it inside the content, just like that. So anything inside this body is considered to be the actual like sort of main content area. And anything inside the head is considered to be metadata. And the HTML just basically says, okay, this is where the file starts. This is where the file ends as far as like what you have to actually read. So if I go ahead and refresh, now we're good to go. Is there a question?
Sorry, I have a question.
Yeah.
So you know how you change the page title to my page?
Mm-hmm.
And you know how in the browser it kind of shows like icons or like small pictures next to like the others. Do we also insert a picture like we did before, or is that like a completely new thing?
So that is called a favicon. So the way that you do it, it's called a link tag. So you type in link and then you do favicon like that, and it'll generate the HTML for you. And then you just do the image to here. So it's a special type of link essentially, because it's not actually going to load the image. It's just going to load it in the top corner there.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
So you just type, so just type in basically link, and then you can just do colon, and then in here you just want to do favicon, and that's what you're looking for.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Okay, so basically all of your pages, essentially when you have any of this stuff showing up, basically just make sure that you have that, you just hit that little exclamation point, hit enter, and you're good to go. So this just shows you the same sort of stuff I just talked about there.
Hey, Kieran, I'm just sorry to interrupt, but I think Max is also asking a different question in the chat. I don't know if you've seen it or not, but he's basically asking if a div property collides with the property of its children, what would happen in that case?
So if a div property, so like it depends on what the property is. So if it's hidden, for example, I believe hidden will take precedence from the top down. So essentially what will happen is that it'll still be hidden, whether or not you set hidden to false on the child or not. I don't remember if that's necessarily true. In CSS, it changes entirely based on a whole other different set of rules. There's an entirely different set of rules called precedence rules, which changes the way that it works. Generally speaking, the child will have precedence over the parent. So generally speaking, the things that you set that override the defaults from the parent will be overridden in the child. That is not always the case, though. It depends on what you're doing and how you're doing it. So just keep that in mind when you're taking a look at stuff. Like if you change, for example, the color of the text, and then inside that you change the color of the text on the actual element itself, it will change the color of the text to whatever you said on the child. So if you have an H1 tag inside another tag, it'll change it to whatever is specified on the H1, essentially. So the more specific, generally speaking, the more it overrides. So basically, that's what should happen. But as you'll find out with web development, as you start building out pages, there is an exception to nearly every rule, and everybody just makes stuff up as they go. So just oftentimes it's better to test and find out. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to give you guys 2 or 3 minutes in a breakout room just to try setting up a page about whatever you want and just try messing around with some of the elements and everything that we've run so far. So I'll give you guys a couple minutes to give that a shot. Recording again. Okay. Yeah, so one thing as well, just for sort of those longer tags, like for the unordered list and everything like that. So if I have a page here where I have the H1 for Kieran, and then I have something like hobbies, and I want to do an unordered list that sort of lists off my hobbies, I can do UL, and then I can hit enter, and then I can do LI for each of these, and then just start typing stuff in. So I can do like skiing, all of that sort of stuff as I'm going through, and I can do it one by one if I really wanted to. Another option, if you want to make it a bit faster, is the same system for generating the snippets will also let you do a bunch of fancy things. So one of the things that's fancy is that you can like specify things that go inside of other things. So I can say UL, and then I can do a little arrow, and I can say LI, and then hit enter, and then I'll put an LI inside of my UL like that. And the handy thing is that you can do that for multiple objects as well. So if you know you're going to have 5 things in there, you could say UL, LI, and then you can say times 5, and it'll do all of that for you. So now you don't have to type out any of that stuff. You can get as crazy as you want with that if you want to do like a div, and you want to do like 3 of those divs with like 5 paragraphs inside them as well. You can do that if you want as well, and it'll create 3 divs with 5 paragraphs. So you avoid having to type all that stuff out if you really want to. So just a handy heads up for anything later on. Super handy to use that stuff. Okay, so now we kind of know how to put some content on a page. The question is, how do we make it look like something? How do we actually change what it looks like? So that's where CSS comes in. So like I said earlier, CSS basically defines how the HTML looks. So any sort of adjectives that you have that's sort of the describing words about whatever's on the page, that'll typically be your CSS. So for example, if that's blue block of text that's 3 EMs large, that has an image that's 250 pixels, that will typically be your CSS. So I know earlier we changed the image with the attributes, but you can also change it with CSS as well. The attributes actually are the CSS. It's kind of a bit of a weird one, but generally speaking, you want to make most of your visual changes with CSS. So here comes the awful part of web development, which is that you have a ton of options. So sort of everything that you run into will have a whole bunch of options. And so CSS, you have different options for how you want to use it. So the first way is inline. So let's say, for example, that I wanted to change the color of this text here. What I could do is I could come right in here and I could say style, and I could say is equal to color red. So the style is a word that you're going to see it come up a lot. So basically, we call everything that you change your CSS styles. So essentially, the styles are the rules for how things show up. Same way that you'd have like somebody has a style whenever they're wearing clothes or whatever, right? So we can put that directly on the element like that. So we can have style and then we can say color red. And then, for example, now if I come back and I refresh the page, we can see here I have color red for text. So that's one option. And you could do multiple things. The way that you do multiple styles is you have to do a semicolon at the end of each one to be able to do more. So if you want to make your font size larger, so if I said like font size and I wanted to make it extra large in this case, I can do that. And then now when I come back and do that, you'll see, now it's smaller because extra large, all of those are always smaller than the starting size of H1s, but yeah, so we can put it directly on the element, which is super handy because then you know each element sort of what is working on it. You can do a style tag. And so what that will do is you basically come into your head up here and we go ahead and we create a style tag like that. And then now we can make rules that apply to everything. And this is handy because now it's in a different spot. So instead of just having a whole bunch of like elements all over the place with a ton of different styles and whatever, we can now do things that sort of apply to everything. So if I had, for example, like 3 or 4 H1s like this, then what I could do is I could come inside the style tag and I can start writing CSS. So I could say H1, which is what's called our selector. So I'm saying select every H1. And then in here, I can say color red like that. And now what I can do is I can come back out here and I can refresh and every one of those is red. And then we're good to go basically. And there's a whole bunch of different selectors that you can put in here and we'll talk about them in a second. But yeah, basically what you can do there is you can do everything that you want to have on there. You also have the option of doing things like if you want to say like star, so you want to do something for everything, you can put star and then you can put stuff inside here. If you want to do things that are inside of like the body, for example, so every element just inside of the body, I can do body and then star, and this is basically saying anything that's inside here would show up. And if you hover over it, it'll actually show you exactly what it looks like. So here, when we hover over the selector right here, we see body and it says elements. If I say H1 right here, I can see that this is just selecting for any H1s. And the third option that we have is instead of putting a style tag at the top of our document, what we can do instead is we can put it inside of a file. So we can use the link tag that we saw earlier with favicons, and we can basically just put it into there. So I can say link, and then I can do CSS, and it'll let me say wherever I want to take it, basically, so wherever I want to grab it from. And then I can create a file in here called style.css, and I can do exactly what I was doing before, where I say H1 and then put some stuff in here. This can be handy because CSS is often very long. So basically, instead of having, like some of the largest style sheets I've ever seen were upwards of 20,000 lines. So you do not want to have 20,000 lines of CSS at the top of your file. Otherwise, you're never going to get to the HTML. So embedding files this way is much easier and much nicer. For the most part, though, we're going to be lazy. So we're pretty much exclusively going to be using style tags or inline styling because we're not being paid for this. So we don't have to worry about doing it nicely. So instead, we're just going to do it with mostly style tags that you'll see at the top of the page. So essentially, like I was saying before, we have our selector. So in this case, the selector that's happening here is we're saying H1. This is basically for every tag. Because there's nothing in front of it, we're basically saying, look for a tag with this name on it, essentially. However, what we can also do is if you have an element, one of the things that we didn't talk about, one of the attributes we didn't talk about is what's called classes. So in here, I could say class and I could say main text, right? And what this does is you can have as many of these as you want. So I could say blue, for example, is another one. And then what I can do here is with my style tag, I basically just put a dot in front of it to say that I'm basically going to target whatever the class is. So if I say dot main text, and let's say I want to make this font size larger. So I make the font size, I will say 3em, which is just a large measurement here. And then if we go into, let's say the dot blue, and I go ahead and I say color blue like that. And then let's say I go to the H1, or let's just do that for now. So I have main text, I have font size 3 and then blue. So now because of the fact that we have these classes on here, they're separated by a space, I can just come back in here and refresh, and you can see that one's blue, but nothing else is. So classes can be used as a way to basically say, I want to apply these rules to all the different elements that have it. And when you set a value for a class like that in your CSS, it'll apply to all of them. So I could check blue on like a whole bunch of different places with like a whole bunch of different tags, and now they'll all have color blue ascribed to them, essentially. So yeah, so in this case, we have class text red, for example, and then we can put dot text red and we can have a color red. And the handy thing is this can go on any tag. So essentially, if we want to have red text, we can put red text on literally any tag. We don't have to worry about like if it's specifically on an H1 or anything like that. This is also a good way of doing it if you plan to have it even only on H1s, but you want to have it on specific H1s. This would be a good way to do it as well. You'll see classes come up for a lot of stuff. The next thing is IDs. So IDs is another attribute that you have that's very special in HTML, because you can only have one of them. So if I have one of the same ID per like document, essentially. So if I have this and I have this be the main text instead of being the class, and then set this to main text like that, I basically, if I do this, it won't work properly. It'll only do this first one. So make sure, so ID is basically you're saying that like this is a unique thing that's showing up essentially. Which could be super handy. For example, if you want to have like title and you want to have just that one title show up as a thing, you want to make sure that only that title has that styling applied to it, you put an ID on it essentially, because now you know that it's a unique item. So IDs will be super handy. They'll also be really handy when we start talking about JavaScript. So making sure you know the differences between classes and IDs is really handy, because you'll see when we get to JavaScript how handy they are actually. And so, yeah, basically, so like I was saying, if you have a dot, it's a class. If you have a hash, it's a ID. And if you just have the plain thing, that's a tag. So if I put blue here, for example, then it recognizes that blue isn't a real element, but you see it's looking for an element called blue. So make sure that you put the dot if it's a class, and you can put the hash if it's anything else. You can also add multiple options. So if you want to have your main text and your dot blue be blue, then what you can do here is you can have blue, comma, and then you can have hash main text. So now both blue or main text will show up as blue. Okay, so there are a whole bunch of these different ways of selecting different nested elements in different ways. In fact, the system that I just showed you previously for generating code, emit is what it's called for doing the snippets. Basically, anything you type in there will show you exactly what it would do. So like, for example, when I was typing in UL and then LI, well, now you know when you do that, that the way that I set that up, where I typed UL and then I said LI like that, this is actually the CSS selector as well. So if I take that, put it up here, go like that, and I say color blue, and then let's say I put some stuff inside here, like that. If we come back, that'll be blue. So emit will actually, if you have your CSS selector like this, it'll actually generate it based on whatever you say for that. So it can be super handy for doing that. So essentially, like if I wanted to create an ordered list that had some sort of a class on it, like let's say I had the class of blue on the unordered list instead, I could say ul.blue, hit enter, and it'll create ul with a class of blue. And if I wanted to just keep adding more stuff to that, like ul.blue.main text, and then hash main like that, then it'll do all of that for me. So it can be super handy for generating that information. And if you get used to working with CSS selectors really well, you can also then have it automatically generate your HTML for you. So super handy way of getting stuff done really quickly. Okay. So now that we have all of that, here's a question. How could we make all the text that we're seeing on the left-hand side here, so this text snippet right here, what CSS would we use to make it all red? All righty. So looks like most people ended up going with C on this one. So the actual answer in this case is B. One way that you can actually tell pretty easily is if you type something in wrong, it actually won't show up with this blue color. So you can see here that we have color and it's blue. And then here we have the white. If you ever type in the wrong property, you'll see that it actually shows up in a different color. So when we're in here and we start typing something, for example, if I go ahead and I say P, and then I say color, you'll see it automatically autofills here, and then it'll start autofilling the values if I want to type them in as well in VS Code. So for any color for text, you'd want to use color and then colon and then all that stuff. And then, yeah, font color, text color, all that sort of stuff doesn't exist in CSS. Some things do use font and text in front of them. It's very confusing. It's very annoying. Oftentimes you'll forget which ones do what. So for example, if you want to align your text to the center, it is text align instead of being just align. And if you want to do the font size, then it is font size. So very annoying that some of them are different. But yes, the color is how you change the actual color of the text. And then the background color is how you would change like the background of the text. So if I want to do background color, that would be a different one as well. So yeah, so in this case, it would be B. Okay. Yeah, and like I was saying before, it's hard to remember stuff in CSS. So also, if you forget any of this stuff, you can also just hover over here and you can like select colors whenever you're trying to do certain things. If you want to do like a transparent color and put some stuff on it and like change it around, you basically can just hover over and it'll give you a little picker that you can go through and like choose whatever you want, essentially. Okay, so now we have sort of a second motivating example where we can go through, we can change the background color of some stuff, we can change the colors of things, we can change the color of links, we can change the color of the text, do all that stuff. So what we're going to do is give you a couple of minutes to try basically styling out the pages that you were starting to write before. In particular, we recommend trying out doing the background color, the font family, the font size, and the color. And if you're working in VS Code, if you're not sure how any of them work, like for example, this font family, when you go through to try and select it, it will give you a little list you can pick from of items. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to try that out. Okay, so it's basically threw together a quick page for two reasons. I want to show you guys something a little bit weird. So as you can see here, I have my text that shows up. And if we look at the style that I basically have my body is set to having some color white. I have my paragraph being set to red. And then I have color green set on my link. So one thing that we can do in CSS is you can actually add comments by doing /* and then you can do star and then / to end it. So essentially you can have like /*, this is my text styling. And then like 10 lines down, you can put /* like that. Basically this starts it, this ends it, same idea, sort of end tags. You can put in whatever comment you want. But now that I've commented out that color green, what color do you guys think this text is going to be? Let me put this back up again. And it's inside the paragraph tag as well. White, it is white. So this is one of the very weird situations that I was talking about with CSS, where oftentimes it's better to check than guess. So in this case, I have P set to color red. I then have the anchor tag inside of P. But if I actually refresh the page, you'll see everything else is red except for the link. This is one of the weird cases where this star, so essentially with links, it will ignore the actual, the precedent set by this paragraph. So whenever you're looking at any of your CSS stuff and you're wondering what's going to happen, the answer is you'll probably have no idea until you actually just try it. So don't bother trying to like theory, speculate, guess, or do any of that stuff. This isn't like this isn't a course. Just go out and do it. Just see what happens. And if you want to see, so if I go ahead and put this back, and I wanted to know that by just looking at the page, the other thing that I can do is on basically any modern browser, you can right click and then hit inspect. And what will pop up is if you go ahead and head across to this right-hand side here, you can actually see the rules that are showing up on the right. So you can see here, here's the rule that I specified. It'll actually tell me where it's specified. If I click this, it'll show me exactly where on the page it was specified as well. And I can just turn this off and I can see, oh, it's green. I thought it's white rather. I thought it would have been red, but no, because red's lower down here than white. So I can see exactly what was going on. So if you're ever testing stuff out and you're thinking, hey, I wonder what's going to happen if I remove this thing, you can just come in here, right click it, uncheck it, and see what happens before you do it. Okay. Perfect. So some other stuff. So there are some styles that are used that are pretty universal. Basically, every element will have these styles. So height is one of them. Shockingly enough, it's used to set the height of an element. I know, surprising. Width is used to set the width of an element. We're getting a little bit wild with these definitions here, but and both of these have max and min. So essentially what you can do is if the content is going to grow, but you don't want it to be below a certain size, you can set the min height or the min width of something so that it shows up at least this size, essentially. And you can set the max to say, even if the content goes over this, only allow it to grow to this size. So essentially you can do that for the height and the width of an element as you're going. There's an example in the folder, if you're interested, under /measurements.html that shows you sort of how this works. There are a whole bunch of measurements units. We're not going to worry about most of them. The main ones that you need to care about are percentage. essentially what it says is that it's the percentage of the parent of whatever it is. So when I'm looking at, for example, this LI in here, and I say 50%, it is 50% of the unordered list that's above it. Same thing with a div. If I put all of this inside of a div, it would be 50% of whatever the sizing is. So if you're looking at something like this body, for example, and I go ahead and I say a div, I put this inside of the div like that. No, VS Code would cooperate. Put this inside the div like that. It's now going to be 50. If I set this to 50%, it would be 50% of the size of the div. So if I made the div like 500 pixels wide, it would be 250 pixels inside of here, not the entire like size of the document, essentially. If you want the entire size of the document, there's two measurements you can use, VW or VH. This is basically the viewport width and the viewport height. This is the absolute size. So if you say like 100 VH, that's 100% of the viewport height. So it's 100% of like this height from the top to the bottom of the page. If I then say 200, for example, that means that I'm going 200% of the width of the page, and it would go 2 pages like tall, essentially, worth of content. Same thing with the width. EMs are a bit weird, so we'll just skip over those for now. Pixels are exactly what they sound like. They're pixels. CH is characters. So if you have something that you want to set to say basically have like 70-ish characters show up, it's not exactly 70 characters. There's a lot of reasons for that, but essentially you want like around 70 characters to show up. You could say like width 70 CH, and it would be exactly 70 characters wide, essentially. So there's more details down there, but those are just some of the measurements that we use. Generally speaking, just play around with different ones and see what you want to use. You'll get used to them as you start using them for different things, but those are the basic measurements that we use. So when we're looking at this, for example, on this page, we've set the viewport width, or sorry, the height to 100 VH, which means that it's 100% of the, like 100% height of the viewport, essentially. If I went through and I had something that was like 200 VW, then it means it would be twice the width of the viewport as well. So in this case, where I said text align center, the hello would show up on the far right-hand side of my screen until I scroll to the right, basically, as I went through this, because it's 200% of the width of the page that it could possibly be. And that's based on your monitor. So if you view it on your phone, it would be specific to your phone size as well. It's whatever the size of the resolution of the actual device is itself. Okay, so now let's look at how like padding and spacing works generally in HTML. So we talked about the size. That was the first part in here. We then have the padding, the border, and the margin. So long story short, basically all these stack on top of each other. So if we made like if we made like the padding 5 pixels, the border 5 pixels, and the margin 5 pixels on the left-hand side, it would be 15, essentially. It'd be 15 pixels away from the next element next to it. So essentially these all stack, they stack in order. If you ever forget the order, the lovely thing about browsers, again, like I was saying, we go ahead and we inspect an element. So we like check out this element. If I come to this computed tab, it'll just tell me all these things from here. And I can see exactly what it looks like. So if I see padding left here and I go ahead and I put like 50 pixels like that, hit enter, it'll add 50 pixels worth of padding right there. And now it's gone from the side. So I can see exactly what it looks like whenever I want to do it. So padding is the first layer. And what it does is actually expands the background of your content as well. So if you add 5 pixels of padding around like a square, for example, it will be 5 pixels of padding around it. They'll take whatever the color is of the background. So if it's black, for example, you'll then have a square. So like if we have a square that starts off at 25 pixels and width and height. So it's basically a square, 25 pixels wide and big. Essentially what we can do then is if we expand it by 5 pixels on all sides with the padding, we now have 30 pixels of black square, essentially, because we've expanded it and it will also take the background with it when it expands. So the padding basically increases the actual, like the content essentially inside of it. Margin does not. Margin will, if we put 5 pixels of padding around that square and it was 25 pixels by 25 pixels, we will have a 25 pixel square with a gap that doesn't have the same color background. So if we have a black square on a white background, we'll have a 25 pixel by 25 pixel square, and then we'll have 5 pixels of gap that's just white, basically. So padding includes the background, margin doesn't. So if you ever want to add like a gap between some things and you're trying to do it with padding and you don't want them to look like they're touching, then add margin instead, basically. And then border, you could use this for spacing. I wouldn't. The thing that you can use it for that's cool is you can basically use it to make like really weird styles of different things. So one example is the border radius. So if you change the border radius, it'll change what it looks like. So if we have an image, for example, and then we add a border radius, so in this case, 0% border radius, so just give us a square. 5% will give us these nice rounded corners. You could also make it different across different like sides. So for example, in this case, we have 5% rounding in the top left and the bottom right. And then we have 15% in the top right and bottom left, which gives this kind of cool effect. And 50% will give us like a nice little circle. So you can also use borders for weird things. You can make them like wavy lines and do like all of that stuff if you want to go like full 90s on this. But generally speaking, you're basically going to use them to make it look cool. You're not really going to use it for spacing. You could technically if you want to. I wouldn't, but up to you. So far we talked about CSS and how to make things look good. But the thing is that just because you know sort of how like to do things like change the color and everything like that doesn't mean you can actually make things that look decent. So the question is, how do we actually make something look good from scratch? So we're going to talk about some common practices. There's a guide here that I've included that has a bunch of other ones as well if you're really interested. But we're basically going to talk about some of the basics to try and make your site have a site that basically people actually want to visit instead of just having it together. So the main principle with this is working your way inward. Whenever you're doing HTML, CSS, everything like that, the reason why I specified earlier that everything sort of works its way inward in terms of like hierarchy is because that's also how you want to design things. So if you have general rules that you want to use, you want to build them from the most general spot and then work your way inward. So just an example of this, what we're looking at here is this thing that says that's like a star, and then we have these different pieces on here. Long story short, you can just copy paste this code. It's in the slides. But what this does is it just changes how the math works. So if we just go ahead and we do star and we say box sizing, border box, and we do margin 0 and padding 0. So all this does is for every element, this just gets rid of everything that's there by default. So every browser has a different opinion on what the default should be. All of them are wrong, it turns out, no matter who you talk to. Every single browser is always wrong about everything that it does. So what we do here is we basically say, I don't care about what you think you're correct about, just get rid of all of it. I don't want to deal with it. I don't want to see it. I don't want to touch it. Just give me a plain file that makes no assumptions about how I want to design it. And that's basically what we've done here. So this box sizing basically says, long story short, this basically just makes the math easier. If you're interested, there's a link in the slides. And then this margin and padding basically says any existing margin and padding that you think you're clever enough to have set up, get rid of it. I don't want it. Leave me with nothing. And I'll start from my own. Basically, I'll start from scratch. And then also we set the font family as well. That's just because by default, the font that's included is awful. So we just say sans serif. I don't know why people decided that web pages should look awful by default, but they did. So we have to change those things around ourselves. So now if we go ahead, refresh the page, we can see here, because I got rid of the color, everything is black. So I have to come back here and I have to change the color again because I didn't even think about that. Hold on. I'm just going to get rid of this black background here. Go ahead and refresh. You can see here, we now have normal looking text and absolutely zero padding on anything. Okay, from there, we then wanted to decide what our content section is going to be. So essentially from here, usually you could just use the body if you really want to. So you just basically dump your content directly in the body, which is what we've done here. All of our content's just inside the body. Some people don't like doing this because there are some like pieces of HTML and or JavaScript and like CSS and stuff that they're going to import that attach to the body itself. So what some people like to do is they like to do a div and then put everything inside of that div as well. So if you want to do that, you could do that. And then all you do is basically you give it an ID of like content, for example. So I go div, I go ID content. And then now instead of targeting the body, I target the ID for content. That's just because sometimes when you like import a library, you import some code from somebody else, they might mess around with the body. This just makes it easier. You can pick whichever one you want. It's up to you. You can also do it with a class as well if you really want to do that. It's entirely up to you. Just pick something to be your main content section. So now that we've decided what our main content section is, the question is, we have to decide what the content width is. We have to decide the font settings, the color scheme, and then individual elements. So breaking this down, the content width is basically going to be how much space our page is going to take up of the viewport, which will be important in a second. Our font settings, we'll talk about that in a second. What colors we want, this is very important because if you make something black that's higher up and you forget to change something like down low that's supposed to have some text on it to white, you'll get exactly what we had last time where you can't see anything. So you want to make sure you have that correct. And then how to change individual elements as well. So first of all, the content width. So there are a lot of different like theories about how you should do this. Essentially, if we go through here, there is what's called full bleed versus just regular designs. So if we take a look at this, a full bleed design goes straight the way to the edge. So if I go ahead and click on this, we can take a look at it. I forget which one it was. I think it was like this one. Nope, not this one. Which one was it? I don't know why I didn't like the exact one that we were looking for. There it is. So you can see here, this one goes right the way to the edge of the screen. So the entire page is used for all of this content as we're going through. There are other sites, like for example, my site, where some of it goes 100% across the screen, but then you can see all the other stuff is kind of like tightly inside here. And then there are other pages which are completely padded. So if we're taking a look at something like this, when it eventually loads, come on, I believe in you. You can see here, nothing touches the edges on this page. There's absolutely nothing that touches the edges anywhere. So you might be wondering why you'd want to do this. Basically, there's a whole bunch of reasons, but it comes down to this. When you have a whole bunch of text on the screen, the longer you make it, if people have to turn their heads and look, it makes it harder for them to read. So for stuff that has a whole bunch of text, you tend to want to sort of like scrunch it a little bit so that people are only looking at a portion of your screen. That's the basics of it. That's all there is to it. Everything that we'll be looking at is pretty much practical as far as that goes. So when we're looking at the content, the two things I've suggested here is where you say margin 0 auto. What this does is it says the top and bottom should be set to 0. So don't put any margin on the top or bottom. And then auto says fill the sides. So this centers your content basically. So all your text will appear in the center of the screen. So if I go through and I have my div with content right here, I go through and I say margin 0 auto, like that. When we come back to the page and refresh, well, everything, if I set a max width to, let's say, 50 characters, something like that, you can actually see, and then refresh, you see everything goes to the center from there. So all this says is set everything to the center and then pick a size. This is where the character counts come in. Generally speaking, something like 90 to 150 characters is super handy. If we take a look at the Shield Connect log, for example, because I was just redoing this a little while ago, if you take a look at this one I think is 90. So everything in here is kind of easier to read because you only have to let your head travel and your eyes travel to here, then it can come down. So super handy, good way of doing it. Okay, typography, so text, fonts, everything like that. There's a whole bunch of options you can change with all of this stuff. The things that are mostly important is make sure that your fonts have a font family to them. So I said sans serif previously. And then just make sure that you have sort of sensible defaults for all these things. So we're going to go through, I'm just going to give you some default values you can use for this because trying to talk about how like the different like rules behind all this is kind of annoying. So the question is, oh, and then there's also a resource here for how to load your own fonts if you want them. But basically line heights are essentially how much space each line takes. If you make this too small, as you can see here, this is a lovely page. It's very easy to read. Absolutely no problems at all. For a 1 line height, you can see that's very tight. If you try and read that, it's going to be really hard. Most people are not going to be able to skip lines properly with that, especially if English isn't their first language. And then this one is really hard to read as well. Default 1.6 is really good. So if I just come in here and I were to say, for example, line height 1.6, that's basically a pretty good default. As your text gets smaller, you want to increase that number, but generally speaking, 1.6 is pretty decent. As you can see here, that's much easier to read for people. So you can just set that as default, leave it at that, you're good to go. Also, make sure as well with smaller text, you need more line height, but also bugs can be caused. So you can see here, there's an underline happening, and you can see here it breaks if I don't set a high enough line height. So make sure you set your line height properly if you're going to do underlines as well. There's a tool for talking about how to like see those different things. But generally speaking, 1.6 is going to be a good option. Text align, you probably don't need to change this, but if you want to, if you set it to center, it'll make everything centered even more. Font size, you don't really need to change this either. If you can, if you really want to, but you can just, if you do use EMs, that's usually the easiest. EM is basically just a multiplier. So 1.1 EM means 110% of the standard font size. 1.2 EM, 120, 0.8, 80%. It's basically a percentage. So you can just multiply it by that and you're good to go. Font family. I said sans serif for most elements. Generally speaking, I'm going to be entirely honest with you. You pretty much never want to change this from sans serif. This is just a personal opinion, but I hate every other font type. So you pretty much just use sans serif for everything. You can also use cursive if you want to have Comic Sans, have a nice little, it looks like it's been drawn in crayon by a child. That's a super handy one as well if you ever want to do that. But generally speaking, sans serif is what you're going to want to use for most stuff. So here's the code for all of that I just recommended. It's in the speaker's notes. Don't bother trying to memorize this. Just copy it out of here and then just learn what each of the individual pieces do. And then you can start learning from there to change it. So what we're going to do now is basically take the page that you currently had and go through and try and add some of the changes that we just talked about. So you can go through in the speaker's notes. You can copy that these lines of text right here, and then go through and start changing it, playing around with it, messing around with it to see how to make it look a little bit nicer. If you want images to use as well, you can grab images from a website called Unsplash. So if I go ahead and pull this up, you can just grab some images from here to use as well. You can just right click essentially, and then just hit copy link, and you'll be good to go. So, sorry, copy image link if you're on Edge. So copy that image link and you can use it for your images as well. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to give that a shot. Alrighty. So next thing to talk about is colors. Generally speaking, every person has their own opinion about colors. The one thing that's generally pretty universal is color is nowhere near as important as readability. This one, the bottom left, is awful because you probably didn't even realize there's text in here. So the main thing with any colors that you're doing is that no matter how cool it looks, please do not pick colors that nobody can read on. If you're going to put text on something, make sure there's actually text that you can read. Please don't put text that nobody can read. So that's the main thing. The question is, how do we make things readable? Well, one is contrast. So contrast is basically the difference between the lightness and darkness, as well as the difference between the colors and how similar they are. So when we're taking a look at this, it's really hard for most people to read because the colors are so close that you can't really tell what's going on, compared to something like this, where it's white on black and it's complete opposites of the spectrum, essentially. So these two pages are fine as far as contrast goes because they're easy to read. And the reason for that is that they're sort of on the opposite ends of the color spectrum for black and white. If you want to know if you have enough contrast, all that sort of stuff, there's accessibility guidelines you can use. There's tools that automatically do it for you. When you're actually looking in Chrome, I noticed this the other day as well. If I go ahead and hover over this color, I think if I change the color to black, for example, and then hover over it, it'll actually tell me what the contrast ratio is, and it'll give me little check marks as well. So super handy if you're trying to figure out what colors look like. Usually this can figure it out. So super, super useful. Okay, dark does not equal black. So dark themes, a lot of times, they rarely are actually black. The reason for this is that if you're old and you make it completely black on completely white, most people will have kind of issues. There's actually an article that talks about this in here. I think it has a picture of the astigmatisms that form. So halination is basically what's called, technical term for it. Basically what it means is that when you have something that's black on white, what you actually see is something like this for people who have bad eyes, where the text starts sort of shifting on top of itself and people can't read it properly. So generally speaking, we've given you some colors here. So we've given you some colors you can use for the dark colors and then some foreground colors for the text that goes on top of it, basically. So if you just want to go ahead and copy paste those, you can just copy paste those into your projects and use them like that. Next thing, please, for designs, do not burn people's eyes out. These two have high contrast, but they hurt your eyes to look at, and they also hurt my soul. Please do not use these colors. When you're looking at colors, essentially, when you're looking at it, if you look at it from a distance and it actually hurts your eyes, it's a bad idea. Unless that's what you're going for. Unless you're going for a Caillou theme sort of site, I would avoid using red on yellow, just in general. Same thing with this purple on green. Unless you're going for a Scooby-Doo theme site where nobody has to actually read the content, just pick colors that are sort of easy to set on top of each other. And then one last technical point that's sort of important. If you get a weird space, like you can see here where there's red on this backdrop and then there's black in the middle, make sure you color whatever background color you're going to use, make sure it's on the HTML element. So the HTML element sits outside of every other element, including the body. So if you color just the body, it won't show up properly. So make sure that you set your HTML to also have that color. Otherwise, you'll have a little gap right at the edge. So just be careful with that. And then the last one, step 4, is how to style individual elements after you've picked your colors and all that sort of stuff. Basically, go nuts. Just do literally whatever you want. There's tons of weird stuff you can do. You can like change like the shadows, index, backgrounds, whatever you want. There's a bunch of links in here that you can click on to see how to do all those different things. There's infinite ways of changing this, so you can just do whatever you want for that. We talked about precedence already, but one thing that I will mention with precedence, so we talked about the different ways of using CSS in your browser. A file automatically will take lower precedence than any of the styles that are in the HTML itself. So if you have like a style tag like this, anything in here will take precedence and override anything that's inside here. Anything that's on the element will also take over that rule. So if I say like style is equal to color orange like this is now the most important thing, unless you specify that it's important. So then the way you do that is, let's say this is really important, this is color red, I can do an exclamation point important. So basically shout at the browser and tell it it's important. If you do this, it will then override everything below it, unless it also says it's important. So if you're using a CSS file, you don't want to use these as much, just because otherwise people can't override them if they bring them into their own project. But if you need to override something that exists, you can use this hash important and it'll show up. If you're when in doubt and you just need something to actually work, put it on the element, put an important on the end, takes the highest precedence of anything. Doesn't matter whatever anything else says, nobody cares. This is the most important thing. So just keep that in mind. And there's a video with the rules here. I'm going to be honest with you, I just guess and check. I don't have time to memorize like 60 different sets of rules for how this works. I just guess and check. So I would just do that as well. So yeah, that's exactly what I was just talking about. So there are as you've seen with CSS, there are like 1,000 different things with CSS that you can do. So it's not about memorizing things with CSS. It's just about learning different tools for like different things that you want to do. So some really great resources for that are down below. So we have some resources about front-end development here. Kevin Powell especially is really good. And then some resources on the web for written content as well. Things like MDN or W3 Schools or CodePen, any of these things will actually give you like written information about like how these different things work and what they do and sort of the support that they have across different browsers and stuff like that. So super handy. Writing all the CSS really sucks. So next week, we're going to talk about CSS frameworks, which help to address this problem in a much easier way. So we'll talk about that next week. So don't be sitting here thinking to yourself like, oh God, we're going to have to learn like a million different things in CSS. CSS frameworks will help us kind of get rid of a lot of this complexity. We'll talk about it next week. So the last thing I want to talk about, I already talked about a little bit, but stealing like a developer. So here is the wonderful thing. Anything that shows up in your browser is loaded in your browser, which means that you can basically take any of that code. And if you're wondering how it works, you can just find out. You don't have to ask anybody. You don't have to ask permission to find these things out. You just go through and you can look at the code yourself. So the dev tools are super handy for doing things like finding the HTML, CSS, JavaScript, as well as network traffic stuff that we'll talk about later. So if you can see exactly what signals your browser is sending to other people, performance auditing, so you can see how fast your pages are loading compared to other pages, as well as like the data that your site is sort of storing about you as you're going through it. So the most important tool for any web developer, inspect element. So if we go ahead and we take a look at Shield Ignite, and I want to know, wow, this is kind of cool. How does this work? I right click and I hit inspect element. In here, I can see on the right-hand side, this is exactly how it's done. And that's basically it. Investigation over. That's how it works. And then if I want to see what things are doing what, I can just check these things off. So I can check like these things off as I'm going. I'm like, no. Oh, that seems to have fixed it. So the WebKit stroke width seems to have set it up. So that's how the letters are showing up. Okay, and what's this? Stroke color. Oh, okay, so that's changing the color. All right, so these two things are important. Okay, and what does this do? Oh, that makes it big. Okay, now I know. So you basically go through, check off and uncheck these things to see exactly what's going on. And if you want to know where they're from, you just click this little thing on the right-hand side. It'll show you exactly which file it's from. So in this case, it's the index.css. And in this case, it's the 8713th line. So it just shows you exactly where it's from. So you can find it in your own style sheets as well. This is a very underappreciated tool, very handy tool. Use this often. Trying to guess what's going to happen, like I said before, not easy. You can just check. So just check. Okay. Oh, and you can also, the other thing as well, you can go the other way around. So if you have your dev tools open and you want to figure out what this thing is, you just click this little button right here, and this will let you select an element visually. So you can just click that, and then I can look at it, click on this one. Oh, cool. So that's what this element is. I can see it in there. If you like the HTML that somebody is using, you can also right click and then you can hit copy and you can copy the entire element. And what this will do is it'll actually copy just all of that HTML when we're looking at it in there. So all that HTML was just copied from there. So super handy. I included a notice in here. You can actually edit an entire web page and then save it with your browser as well. So if I go through and I were to like edit this thing around and I made changes in here. So I said like color black instead, which in this case isn't going to help anything because everything is specified lower down. So let's say I say this one and I say color black. That is the wrong thing again. There we go. Third time's the charm. Color black. There we go. That one actually worked. And I make these changes. So you can see here it adds it in line. Then what I can also do is I can just right click and I can, I can just press Control S in the browser and I can save this somewhere if I really wanted to. So I can just go through, save it somewhere, and it would save it along with a bunch of the HTML, CSS, and all that sort of stuff. Don't become reliant on this, but if you do want to use this for some of your first couple of web pages, that's perfectly fine. It'll work pretty well. When you get to more complicated things, it might break. So just keep that in mind, but it is something that you can do. So yeah, you just right click, save as, and then you can export the changes. And it'll only export changes that you edit in, when you click on an element, it'll only export changes you edit right here. These changes are changed temporarily to the CSS file. These changes are written in line. So if I say like font size 3 EM, for example, in here, you can see in the HTML, it's added a style tag to the HTML itself and then put that in there. Those are the only changes that'll save. Everything else you do, it doesn't care. Browser doesn't care at all about anything else you do. That's the only change that'll get saved. So keep that in mind. Okay, we wrote an article this week as well if you're interested about some extra functionality that you can get out of HTML. So if you want to click on that, take a look at it. There's a whole bunch of cool, fun things you can do. Like, for example, how this table of contents thing is set up is actually using one of the things that we talk about in here. So if you're curious, you can check out that link. It's on the Shulk Knight blog. So wrapping up, basically today we covered a whole bunch of the basics of HTML and CSS. So next week, we're going to look at how to get some fancier CSS working, including mobile supports using CSS frameworks. This will basically do a lot of the work for us, which is very handy because I'm lazy and most other people are lazy as well. So next week, we'll look at how to basically use those to try and avoid having to write all of our own sort of style sheets ourselves. And we'll also look at JavaScript to start making our pages interactive. So for the first end of session exercise this week, we're basically going to be styling an article. So if we go ahead and take a look at the day one folder inside the Shulk Knight files, if we go ahead under exercises and then end of session exercises, we can see here there's a whole bunch of stuff. If I go ahead and I'll pop up on my Visual Studio Code, we take a look at this README file. Like I said in session 0, just press Control Shift and V or Command Shift V on a Mac, and it'll show you the preview of what this page looks like. So you can see in here, it'll have deliverables. So there's level 1, level 2, and level 3. So you have to complete level 2 in order to do level 3 as well. So basically you have to do all the levels for this week if you want to get the full points, the full 35 points. But what you'll be doing is you'll basically be making articles. So level 1, level 2 is this basic article on the left-hand side here, and then level 3 is making a dark theme article. So you'll basically be given some starter HTML on the left here. So we have level 1, level 2, level 3. If you're planning on doing level 2 anyways, just start with level 2. You can skip level 1 entirely because they build off each other. And then you can see here, there are some example pages. So you can take a look at some images that show you an example of like how you could do this and like what the example output should look like. So what we're going to do is we will give you guys a couple of minutes to try that out with your mentors in here, and then we'll go from there.
A couple of things that I want to mention, I guess, before we send you guys off in this last breakout room for today, is that we will be expecting some representatives from the Calgary to Space club that's at the U of C campus. And what they basically do is that they try to launch a satellite basically to the space. And so they're going to be talking about some of the software that kind of goes into the development of that whole kind of big launch. And so I guess be ready and excited for that for the second session. Another thing that I want to talk about is the fact of how everything that you will basically mostly see in this web development course is that we're going to be covering everything from the front end to the back end. And so I know that most of you guys here are university students, and if not, you guys probably have kind of encountered some HTML or some CSS before. So don't be discouraged by that in any kind of way. And I think even knowing CSS and HTML myself, I think I've learned a couple of things from Kieran that are kind of like hidden gems or secrets here and there. However, later on we'll be shifting to the backend side of things. So if you're waiting for that and excited about that, just kind of wait. And I think starting from session 4 onwards, it'll be much more exciting if you are interested in the backend side of things. However, I still thought it was pretty exciting today. So other than that, am I missing anything, Kieran, or that I brought up with you? No?
I think that's everything.
Cool. Yeah, other than that, we'll send you guys off into your breakout room sessions. Usually there's 15 minutes at the very end. However, today we're running a little bit late. So we'll give you guys until 7:35 to ask your mentors any last minute questions.